Welcome to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno.
Who was John Keel? Was his reporting on paranormal events reliable? And what is a window area?
Hello and welcome to the 841st edition of Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno. I am Ben, and those questions came from my co-host, partner in the paranormal adventures, and Dad, Paul. And we will certainly keep us on an even keel today. And we welcome your calls. The number is 401-766-1240. That's from anywhere. Or you can email Paul at behindtheparanormal.com or contact us by Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
And unless there be any doubt, we're actually here live today after 2 weeks of reruns because of the two Western Eastern Easter dates. And I, at this point in my kingdom for a barber, since I'm beginning to look like one of the creatures we talk about on the show.
Well, yeah, just don't copy me and shave your head, because then no one will be able to tell us apart.
No, that's true. Anyway, with us via Skype today is Brent Raynes, who has investigated and researched UFOs since 1967. That's the year I graduated from grammar school, Brent. The editor of Alternate Perceptions magazine, he has written several books, including John Keel, The Man, the Myths, and the Ongoing Mysteries, which will be our subject today. Brent has traveled extensively across the U.S. and Canada to interview witnesses and researchers. Assisted by his interaction with the First Nations, Brent takes a global and historical perspective on UFO studies, and he interrelates parapsychology, shamanism, Jungian archetypes, and ufology.
So, Brent Raynes, welcome to Behind the Paranormal.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Paul. It's a pleasure and an honor to be your guest today.
Oh, hey, it's a pleasure to have you. So let's start off with something relatively or seemingly simple and broad. So, Brent, give us an overview of who John Keel was, along with how and why he got involved in paranormal research.
Well, John Keel, as a young man, had a lot of interest in space, and he was interested in 14 items, and he was an amateur magician. In fact, he dreamed early on as a young child of being a stage magician, and he was always practicing different sleight of hand tricks and things. But at age 14, he loved reading. He called himself a reading machine, and on such a variety of subjects. And he was interested also in chemistry and science, and so at age 14, in a local in Perry, New York, there was the Perry Herald, and this editor saw Keel as being someone who might like to try his hand at writing. He seemed to have a lot of reading experience, and so he let him write a column called Scraping the Keel. It was a weekly feature. He wasn't always on an even keel, and he would make $2 a week at that, and so he was encouraged that writing was what he really wanted to do, and he could write on all kinds of different subjects. And he said he got his humor from his mom. He was always writing humorous things, and he liked science fiction. And so he just had a great time, and then when he was, age 17, he actually decided he wanted to make a career of it, and he thought that the Big Apple, New York City, was the place to go. So one day he was told that he was to go out and work the fields, and help with some farm work, and he really didn't want to, and he told his mom that he was leaving. And this was 17. He had 75 cents in his pocket. Started hitchhiking his way to New York City. He went down the road, and she thought, he'll be back. And after 2 days, he finally made it to New York City. He became an editor for a poetry publication for about 2 years, and he wrote little things for radio stations and such, and anything he could get a job at. But his interest in unusual phenomena actually stemmed from when he was 7 years old. He was in an interview with Tim Beckley, Mr. UFO, they call him.
A good friend of ours, one of our guest co-hosts.
He did an interview with John Keel somewhere around the mid-'70s, and John told him that when he was 7 that he had seen a sphere of light with his stepfather and his mother. They were driving through an area of New York State, and at first I thought it was a barn on fire up on a hill. And his stepfather was driving, pulled over, and they watched. And after a while, he said this big barn-sized round sphere rose up into the air. And at that point, they knew it wasn't, a mere barn on fire. This was something really anomalous. And as I recall, then it just sort of took off into the night sky. And when he was 10 years old, people in his rural area around Perry, New York, some of the farmers were reporting a gorilla that some people had seen crossing a nearby country road. So everybody got worried, and people went out with their shotguns and started looking for this thing. But as often happens, it stopped happening, and that was it. And people, after a while, forgot about it. But of course, these kind of things figure prominently in a lot of stories that we've heard about Bigfoot and other cryptids over the years. They come and go. And so anyway, that plus the fact that Keel felt early on around adolescence that he had sort of psychic awareness that there was a poltergeist in his grandparents' farm, and in the room that he stayed at, there would be knocking sounds on the wall, and he tried to develop a code and communicate with him. And then after he had hitchhiked to New York City, he had an apartment just off of Times Square, and claimed that he had a kind of a spiritual illumination experience where he suddenly knew the answers to all the mysteries of life. And he was just overwhelmed. There was an illumination in his room, and he was quite startled by this. But by the next morning, he'd felt he had this download of information, but it was hard to put all of that he had knew the night before. He just had little bits and pieces, and he was quite disappointed, I'm sure. But he kind of developed an atheistic point of view. Initially, he was, kind of skeptical of many stories in spite of the experiences he had. And back around 1951, he got drafted into the military, and they saw that he was a writer, and they could use him over in Germany at a popular, radio station, foreign radio network. And the German people, I understand, really enjoyed his programs. He would do travel, suggest travel places to go for travelers, and he actually spent the night alone, I think, in one of the pyramids in Egypt, and a live broadcast. And there was Frankenstein's castle in Germany. He sent out one of his correspondents out in the field and was telling the stories of Frankenstein and such, and they had someone sneak up on him in the dark and startle on a live broadcast this guy. But
pretty good radio, actually.
And then in 1954, while he was in Egypt, studying the pyramids himself, he was quite intrigued by different cultures. He saw another UFO, a metallic disc-shaped looking craft with a dome on top, the classic flying saucer, in the upper Nile over the what he called the Aswan Dam, just hovering there. And then again, after a while, it took off at a high acceleration. And so he later that year, 1954, he ventured across went to Baghdad and through India and the Himalayas and eventually ended up in Singapore the following year, and then wrote a book called Jadoo, Mysteries of the Orient. And he went in, using his knowledge of magic, and he wanted to expose a lot of the fakery that went on, the so-called holy men who would charge tourists so much money to do various feats. And he learned the secret of a lot of their tricks being buried alive, and the Indian rope trick and so on. But then there were things that he experienced once again that he couldn't explain. He realized that there were some genuine Buddhist monks who were using telepathy. There was one gentleman who was considered a very prominent holy man that Keel had been looking for, and the guy ended up locating Keel on a trail that he was hiking. And Keel was quite startled for this turn of events. The guy finds him instead of him finding this man, and he offered to demonstrate his ability to read Keel's mind. And so Keel said, okay. Started concentrating on a pair of boots he was wearing, and the man said, oh, come on, Mr. Keel, you can do better than that. It's your boots, really. So then he tried something else, and again the guy hit it right off. So he asked him how he did it, and he said, well, it would take years for you to achieve this particular skill, but I can give you a general idea. And he described like going down a path, and you watch for different things to appear along this path, and that was a very generalized idea of what he did with his consciousness. So anyway, Keel wrote this book, and it was, to reveal a lot of the crafts, the tricks that a lot of these jadoo artists or so-called holy men would use. But he also, observed some things he couldn't explain. There was also one time he was in a temple with a guy who claimed that he could call in spirits. And suddenly there was a breeze that came through, blew out a candle, as I recall, and there was a three-legged wooden stool out of one of the corners of the temple that started coming out. And also there was like a rapping sound on the ceiling. And anyway, it circled around Keel, and he reached out his hands looking for the string, and he couldn't find it. And then it went to another corner, and then the session was over, and he went over and examined the wooden stool and couldn't find any tricks of the trade that he was familiar with. And so he wondered about that. And he also, while he was on this journey, there was the Yeti. And he had heard stories from various villagers that he was going through. And there seemed to be one that was following just ahead of him. And he had seen tracks. He had heard this strange call that the villagers were saying, that's the Yeti. And he did see something at the end of a lake that was, hair covered and looked like it could have been a Yeti, but he couldn't honestly say that it was. It could have been a bear, he said. But he was open-minded about it, especially, going back to New York, age 10 and the gorilla that people were seeing that, everybody talks about, when these things happened back then, they'd say, oh, it was a gorilla that escaped from a zoo or something, and there never would be the report to confirm it.
So we're talking about a sort of paranormal renaissance man here.
Yeah, and he was very much into Charles Fort's writings, 14, the Book of the Dam and Low and such, and early on, and he remembers in 1948, soon after the whole flying saucer craze began, being in a room with about 40 people, a small room where people were arguing over whether the government was interfering and not telling us the truth about these things. And he says they've been arguing ever since.
Can we fast forward a bit, just in the interest of time, to the Mothman era? I think most people associate John Keel with the Mothman events of the 60s, and certainly his book, The Mothman Prophecies. Can you enlighten us in that regard?
Yeah, I wanted to pursue John Keel because he had been such an influence in my own investigative work. And so I had, initiated correspondence with him back in October of '69, and I wanted to find out, there was criticisms about errors in some of his work and such, and we exchanged newsletters where he had a magazine called Anomaly, a newsletter called Anomaly that he sent out free of charge to exchange partners or exchange, like I had a mimeograph newsletter called Sauceritis, and he admitted to the fact that there were errors in a number of his works, and he tried to correct them in Anomaly. And he wrote to me about how, one of his books, I think Operation Trojan Horse, there were a number of glaring errors, and he tried to get it corrected. And I sent them the galleys. They made corrections and sent it to him, and then they didn't correct them even after he'd corrected the galleys.
Yeah, something to be said for print on demand.
Yeah. Now, then it's your fault.
Yeah.
But I won't say they didn't make errors, because he covered a lot of material. And I had, but what interested me was the fact that I'd corresponded with an Aki Frenzen from Sweden and his friend Hakan Blankovic of the Archives for the Unexplained, one of the largest UFO 14 archives and libraries, I think, out there. And they collect a lot of material from worldwide. And anyway, Aki Frenzen didn't really know anything that much about the Mothman, but he thought it sounded interesting, what Keel was working on. And so he had helped Keel with information about Swedish mystery aircraft back from like the 1930s for a chapter that Keel was writing for Operation Trojan Horse. And so he wanted to go to West Virginia himself as a vacation. So he took several weeks off to go there. And he, right off the bat, he had a letter from John Keel, a letter of introduction. He said that opened many doors. While he was in Point Pleasant and the surrounding area, he met Mary Heyer, the newspaper reporter who had helped Keel a great deal. Mm-hmm. And about 30 of the Mothman witnesses. And he said that he felt that they were very traumatized by their experiences, that they often talked about the one thing that really stood out to him was the shining eyes, and they were almost like a hypnotic effect on a number of the people. And he talked with people family and friends who knew these people before their experience and now since their experience. Instead, they were changed.
Yeah.
It was, they were very traumatic, and he noticed they would smoke a lot, and even though he had given up smoking, he started smoking again just listening to their stories. And there was now that, and also I connected with Dan Drazen, who's mentioned several times in Mothman Prophecies, and he went down there in '67. He was a documentary filmmaker. He was going to actually do a documentary for PBS. PBS at the time was interested, and he went down. He met Mary Heyer. He even had later he felt it was a premonition experience related to her passing, because they connected real strongly and felt, he said she was quite psychic, and that even felt that they were somehow maybe, as I recall, like a past life connection, Mm. But
well, I remember in '08 when we first went on the air, one of the first people we wanted to get to know was John Keel, and we were in touch. But then of course he died, translated as we say, the following year, and we never got to know him or had him on the air. However, I remember in 1966, I was like 12 and 13. My mother would point out stories about, that giant bird is back in West Virginia again, in the Hartford Current in Connecticut, where I grew up, and it all came back, when I read his book, and all sorts of other research took place. So we're going to move on to some questions, if we could. I know you haven't given us, been able to complete the full story, but we would refer people to your book. Do you have your book with you?
Sure.
Yeah,
sure,
just hold it up to the camera. There you go.
Here.
Yeah, and it's available. We'll give you a chance to talk about it later, but it's available on Amazon.
Yes.
That's where I got mine. And we have a very faithful listener in Bogota, Colombia. Actually, he sends in such great questions almost every week. He's almost like an honorary guest co-host. This is Peter from Bogota, and you really got him cooking here, Brent. He's sending a bunch of questions. So
Okie dokie. So we might as well start right at the very beginning. So Peter asks first, in the course of writing your Keel book, did you discover any interesting untold MIB cases?
As in Men in Black. Yeah.
Well, I do, I wanted to point out in the book how he influenced my life and a lot of other people around the world. And so I did interviews with people who do Keel, and to show, how that influence affected their work and how they interpreted their experiences, including Rosemary Giles, who actually I interviewed and wrote the foreword to my book.
Oh, yeah, dear friend of ours, another guest co-host. of the show. Yeah.
And she helped me tremendously. She made suggestions of people, in fact, who I should interview in additions, and she knew Keel and would meet with him in New York for lunch, and also attended his 14 Society meetings in New York they had from the 80s to sometime in the 90s. But anyway,
so Men in Black.
The Men in Black. Yeah, I had been studying the whole Men in Black thing, and I come across some good cases over the years that I wanted to include in the book. As far as anything really new that Keel had worked on, the Men in Black, I covered the fact that he had a great deal of interest. He was even looking at a number of things, like the fact that he found suspected that gypsies were a group of people who sometimes, as well as Native Americans, had a lot of these experiences. He felt sometimes that gypsies were actually some of the MIBs, and he was hoping one day to actually maybe track down, sometimes he was just minutes away from having visited a house where an MIB visitation had occurred, the Men in Black.
Interesting concept, yeah.
And so he never did have that experience. He figured, trying to catch a flying saucer, they'd leave the ground before he could get there. But maybe somebody driving around in a black Cadillac or something, he might be able to run down. Now, he did have the experience. He claimed a location called Mount Misery on Long Island, where he got a call and was told to go out there. And he got there, and there was a black Cadillac with tinted windows, and he could see these two dark-suited Oriental men inside, and he was getting out of his car to go talk with them, and the car started moving off, so he got back in his car and followed them, and it went around a corner, and it was a dead end, and there was no black Cadillac.
Wow.
And he wondered what happened here.
Yeah,
so he felt it was a demonstration that there was something to these MIB stories.
Yeah. Now, what's the next question, Ben?
Alrighty,
Peter.
so
Yeah.
Peter writes to us, by the same token, are you aware of any classic MIB cases that have appeared since the 2009 Niagara Falls case?
Well, I've got some cases in my book. There have been some that have occurred since then. It seems to me like the activity has kind of slowed down that nature. Although Alan Greenfield, who's been in this for a long time, has told me that it's still there. You just got to be looking at the right places. In fact, he was the one who John Keel had written me years and years ago that had made him aware of how the MIB turned up in many other frames of reference, including witchcraft. There were a lot of accounts in that area, he said.
Could you give, just for the sake of listeners who may not know might not be familiar with what we're talking about, the MIBs or the Men in Black, what do they actually do, just for the background of the listeners?
Well, a lot of the times they, after someone has seen a UFO, they report that they've been intimidated by someone who approached them and told them to, shut their mouth about what they saw, and they would often feel that it was someone from the government. In other cases, though, the people who were silenced, or these people attempted to silence, would also demonstrate that maybe they were part alien or have sort of an unusual paranormal component to the experience. And Keel was very, very interested in that. And in my book, you'll read where Keel actually described to the well-known writer Brad Steiger years ago how he was introducing Brad, who had been at the time pretty much still following the mainstream nuts and bolts ET perspective about the psychic phenomena. And one time he claimed, John Keel claimed, that he heard a knock on his door, and then these three men in black came into his apartment, and instead of just opening the door, they just walked through it. And then they asked him if, wanted proof that they were aliens, so they reached under his sink and to a cabinet there and pulled out a full bottle of bleach, and all three took sips of it. So they emptied the bottle. And so I guess Keel was convinced this was pretty weird.
All right, well, on that tasty note, we're going to take our bottom of the hour break here. You're listening to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno on WOON 1240 AM and 99.5 FM in New England's beautiful Blackstone River Valley. We'll be right back with Brent Raynes and more about John Keel, so stick with us.
Hi, Parrot Heads. This is Joe Callahan, your maitre d' in the Tiki Bar every Tuesday night from 6 to 7. 1 full hour of nothing but Jimmy Buffett music. The Tiki Bar is brought to you by attorney Bob Lauder and by the Carew Investment Group.
ON Radio, ON Worldwide.
Local and live at 99.5 FM.
Okay, welcome back to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno here on WOON. And where our guest today is Brent Raynes, author, researcher of long experience, and we're talking about his work on the biography of John Keel, who was a New York sort of Renaissance man in the paranormal, known as a journalist, and probably most famous for his book, The Mothman Prophecies, made into the 2002 film with Richard Gere and Laura Linney. One of my favorite films. I guess it was a flop, but I mean, it was one of those classic, I think.
It's kind of like one of those movies you go back to and you're like,
it's a cult movie. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think it's great. The concepts are amazing. So speaking of some of the concepts, Brent, I've always been fascinated, and the movie bore very little resemblance to the actual book, I think. This mainly the concepts. I think you can, the journalist John Klein, I think, would certainly be equivalent, I guess, to John Keel, I suppose. And, Woody Dernberger, the guy who ran into Indrid Cold, the alien on the highway, and that might have been the fella, who lived in the house in the rural area. Anyway, I think it's very interesting that in Keel's book, he talks about the Men in Black, or the equivalent thereof, people showing up. And we actually, when we were in Point Pleasant in 2003, Ben wasn't working with me quite yet, but we were actually talking with some witnesses who were children at the time and grew up. And they confirmed a couple of the stories that John Keel had told about, for example, people after the sightings of the Mothman and UFOs would take place, that people would show up in Air Force uniforms, and veterans would realize that they were wearing insignia in the wrong places, and this sort of thing. Something was wrong. And then incidents wherein people supposedly would look at an ashtray or some ordinary everyday item and ask to keep it as if they had some valuable antique. I mean, what is that? Something Keel was looking into, or did you find? I mean, that was really, I thought, rather fascinating.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that were very, very strange, and I got to interview a couple of people, in recent years who hadn't told their story really, and going back to that period of time, that had experience with some sort of thing like Mothman. And I visited Point Pleasant myself in 1976, and I met some of the witnesses, and including Linda Skyberry and her mom and dad.
Yeah.
And I also called up a Virginia Thomas, who is described in Keel's Mothman Prophecies and Strange Creatures from Time and Space, and she her story was one that Aki Frazen had described, where people were almost like hypnotized. Well, she didn't see the eyes, but it was in the daytime, and she said that it was the clouds were dark. It looked like it was fixing to rain, so she was going outside. And this is in the TNT area, and where her husband worked, and she was going ahead and going to cover up some motorcycles that they had. And all of a sudden, she noticed across in this field, across from the house, there was a tall, dark figure. And she said she couldn't take her eyes off it. It was like, she was hypnotized almost. Mm. And there was like this strange noise in her head. She tried to speak or scream or something at the time, and no words would come out of her mouth. And she said this thing suddenly started running like lightning. She said that's how she described it. Said it was far faster than a human could run, and all she could say, it was a human-looking figure. She later decided that it must have been a robot or something, because it moved so fast. But the thing that really disturbed her was how it just like took over her thinking, and she was like hypnotized by this sight and was unable to look away and unable to speak, yell, anything.
One thing that Keel points out, which I think is very, but I think at the time was very unusual point of view, was the window area idea, which really only Jacques Vallée up to that point had been talking about what we today might refer to as the multiverse or parallel worlds or what have you. I think that was some very advanced thinking on his part. And that led into his discussion in the book of a lot of other things besides Mothman and UFOs taking place in that particular area, the Ohio Valley, in the 60s when he came on the scene. We talked to people there who said that their parents or they would have heightened psychic abilities all of a sudden. We talked with people who had very positive Mothman experiences. They would, I'm thinking of Mr. Colvin there, who's been on the show several times, and he all of a sudden was able to do math and became a rather brilliant artist after encountering Mothman. So all sorts of things and all sorts of ways were taking place. Keel points out that you could go out to a certain place at night and watch the UFOs fly over, or you could signal to them, sometimes with lights, and they would signal back at times. So that leads to the question of what are your thoughts on the flap, because you're a researcher yourself, on the flap area, as we call it, or the window area, as he called it, sort of approach to the paranormal, sort of pan-paranormal areas where things that are not traditionally associated with one another, ghosts, poltergeists, and the UFOs, for example, Bigfoot or whatever, Mothman, do take place. What are your thoughts on that, Brent?
Yeah, there's so many, as you say that, there's so many ideas that strike me here. He connected like ancient Native American sites, earthworks and such that again and again a lot of these events seem to kind of concentrate. And I know in visiting some Native American sites that people out hear reports of UFOs or strange balls of light appearing around these areas. And I think it's a good area to approach. Now I was talking with someone who was involved in the investigation of the Hudson Valley cases back in the 80s, and Dr. Hynek was involved in the investigation of these reports. Yep. And he says, we got these huge craft and, seen at night, flying low over these highways, hundreds of witnesses. Where's the hangar of these things going? Where do they go to after they've, made these spectacular appearances? And he was also reported to have said, John Keel talked about ancient sites, Indian sites and such, where, is there any place like that around here? And they found an area where it seemed like it pinpointed a lot of the activity was concentrating. It led them to this one area where there was this an ancient site that people reported seeing like hooded figures or balls of light around. And it was kind of something that made the investigators think, well, this, maybe Keel was right,
Yeah.
And I know I visited Hynek at his home in September 1972, and I mentioned John Keel to him, and I was kind of surprised. He said, yeah, I find Keel's ideas interesting. And, I noticed in interviews and stuff, and people that got to talk with him would tell me, he talked about other dimensions, but told us one woman that met him at a conference in Brazil said he talked very openly about the possibility, but said that, it might kind of shake things up too much at the moment to talk too openly about it. So he was,
Yeah.
that and alien abductions. He was hesitant to really go into too much.
What about and you brought this up already, Brent, once. What about the reliability of some of Keel's reports? Now, I'm not trying to be disrespectful to him at all. I wish we'd gotten to know him. But as a journalist myself for 40 years, mostly in newspapers and magazines, one does tend to sometimes make mistakes under pressure of deadline, or you have information that you later find out was not accurate. And as you said, he tried to correct that. Are people justified in doubting not the veracity, but the reliability of all the reports, say from Point Pleasant, for example, that Keel gave us?
Yeah, in there's a chapter where I do, I think it's titled John Keel's Ups and Downs, and I go into the things that he said that, he tried to correct or was beyond his control, the typesetters or editors had messed up. But, when he was asked by one of his agents to come out with a book on the Mothman, which became the Mothman Prophecies. And by that time, he'd kind of left all that. He had moved on to other writing assignments, but got convinced to go ahead and put something together. And he had all these notes and things in a suitcase, which Doug Skinner, his friend, now has in his closet. But anyway, he pulled all this out. And one of the things that was definitely his era was the story of how he and Mary Hyre were out sky watching on one of the hilltops one night, one of many nights, and Mary left him, and he was, well, let's see, maybe Mary was there. Anyway, he had read in some local paper that the moon was supposed to appear sometime after 1 o'clock, and he stayed till about 3 o'clock and never did see the moon. So this got written up in his book. But the fact is that it did come up, and it came up a little after 3 o'clock in the morning. And he just didn't stick around long enough, and he didn't double-check what he had read in that newspaper. So, yeah, that was on him there.
Yeah, I think it's kind of unfair to assume that everyone's going to be right all the time.
Oh, of course.
Especially, in the field of journalism, because it's like, if you're making mistakes left and right, maybe you shouldn't be a journalist. And
I fired more than one reporter because they, couldn't get their facts straight.
Right, but I think a really important note here that Brent really kind of started off with his book was with the ethos of. And what we start off the interview with was the ethos of John Keel himself, that he is was by nature, or is, whatever, time doesn't matter, that he's a skeptical guy, right? Mm-hmm. He establishes this sort of thing like, all right, well, all of this stuff is happening, let's investigate and see if it's true. And he goes through the steps, and, he's from that old era of journalism, which he would take with him into the new sort of paradigm era that he finds himself in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. So, you can kind of see in the events of his life him kind of turning into a quote-unquote true believer, but it's through his experiences that, obviously something happened that would turn this man who was so skeptical into what he became.
Well, the thing with journalism, and jump in here, Brent, if you wish, and you can kind of see this happening with some of the people who were associated with us, is that you shouldn't become part of the story. But when you start having experiences of your own, you kind of do become part of the story. And that can be a problem from a strictly journalistic sense. You may be able to write about it in a more literate manner than some people might, because you have the experience. But I've always found that to be a problem. And most of my books are my own experiences, and then books that you and I have written together include our experiences too. So it can be a bit of a challenge that way. However, I've not written for any newspapers except once about any of my cases. All the rest has been straight news kind of stuff. Now, anyway, there we are. So do we have another question from Peter while we have a moment here?
We do, and it's actually a pretty good one. This is a really good question. So Peter also asks, what were John Keel's very last paranormal-related projects, finished or unfinished?
Wow. I'm not really sure. He had, he was having health problems at the time, and I was trying to get him to do an interview with me, and he said interviews are a drag, let's just talk. So he, in fact, there was a woman that had seen kind of had a number of experiences, including a gargoyle and a Mothman type thing, and she so wanted to communicate with John Keel, and I asked him about it, and he said, I don't have anything new to say, really. He said, what I've said in the past, in past interviews, just take one of those if you want and reprint it, And so he, toward the last of it there, he really wasn't doing anything. He really wasn't able to get out and travel like he did, so he felt that he had said everything that was to be said that he knew to say. And I know at the end of it, he also wrote me. I sent him a copy of my first book, Visitors from Hidden Realms, and he made the comment that he felt I had followed a similar path to his. Did my best to offer whatever insight and speculation I could to address the phenomenon, but that in the end, no one knows for sure. His was speculation. He speculated about the ultra-terrestrials, another parallel world. But he says, who knows,
Well, when we were in touch with him toward the end of '08, he wasn't doing any more interviews, but he seemed kind of intrigued with us, and he was willing to talk. But then, of course, he got saved, and then we just didn't hear from him. It was a shame. We should have gotten there a few years earlier, maybe. But it is what it is. So is there another question?
There is. And this
Peter's on a roll here.
Oh, yes. Yes, this is the final question from Peter. And he writes to us, Brent, you have said in past interviews that you have gotten results with a ghost box. You or your associates recorded voices of what might be extraterrestrials. Please share the total communications recorded and the setting. For example, was a UFO being observed at the time?
Okay, well, there was actually an abductee who was also a paranormal investigator. When you've experienced a UFO abduction or close range sighting, a lot of times people develop psychic abilities, or they've had psychic abilities since childhood. This particular person, Brett Oldham, was still in the closet as far as being an abductee, but he was very involved in paranormal investigations, used an instrument called the Ghost Box, which is a digital radio you can get from Radio Shack and modify it where it goes on continuous scan, and the idea is that the spirits can communicate through the white noise between the stations.
Yeah,
so anyway, so I was skeptical.
Yeah, me too.
But anyway, Brett had experiences going back to childhood. About age 5, he'd seen a ghost. At age 5, he'd seen what he thought was a demon, but later realized it was a gray. And had different experiences, which he's written up in 2 books now, the Children of the Gray and the Baby Takers. But at that time, we were involved in working paranormal together. And very first time I attended one of these, we were in an old church that was supposed to be haunted, being used at that time as a community arts center, and it was nearly 100 years old at the time. And we were down in the basement. People had heard footsteps, and nobody was there to make the footsteps and such. So we thought we'd do this session, and I was sitting there thinking about, this was like March of 2010, and we'd lost John Keel July 3rd of 2009. And I thought, what a shame. If there's anything to this, could Keel say something? And I didn't hear anything really. that I could identify. And then we went on another series of investigations. One was in May of 2010. And this time, Brett had the ghost box, and we got a lot of interactive things going on. Also, he said, there was John Keel right there. And then again, John Keel. And I played the audio back, and sure enough, John Keel. And one of the people that we talked to claimed to have seen Bigfoot. And so was asked about Bigfoot, and a voice came back and said, monsters. And I told, and I proved to Brad, I says, look, later on I met him again, and I says, here's my first letter from John Keel. He says he's writing an encyclopedia on monsters. He called Bigfoot and all these things monsters. And in his Strange Creatures from Time and Space, which was that encyclopedia type book, he actually starts out at chapter 1 talking about monsters. He calling them monsters again.
Yeah, he did, yeah. That book is a sort of a Bible for me since I was a kid. Maybe not a kid, but, when I first got into this.
And, so anyway, July 3rd of 2010, we were meeting at the home of Sandy Nichols, who claims to see ghosts and aliens himself, and his house has been called the Paranormal Palace, just south of Nashville, a little town community called Thompson Station. He lives out in a rural area. And so we're doing a ghost box session there. And this is what, convinced me at the time was asked for John Keel, and immediately a male voice says, John Keel. And Brett asked him about Bigfoot, and this voice says, and it was quite loud, and we recorded it, Smuck Bigfoot, see? And, and then I asked about Jadoo. What can you tell us about Jadoo? And the others in the room really didn't know that much about John Keel, if anything. And this voice came back and said, Jadoo, and it sounded like, Jadoo, And I said, yeah, what can you tell us about Jadoo? And this voice went on a long ramble, but it faded in and out. And it said, into the fire. And then it went, blah, 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 and I couldn't tell what it was saying, but we recorded it. And then it says, teach me outside. And the way I analyzed it was, Keel, it was Jadoo meant in the Orient was a word for black magic. And into the fire, maybe that, related to that idea. And then teach me outside. To me, Keel he loved to travel and visit foreign places or places where, there was a story. Not just reading it, but he liked to be a part of it, to be out in the field and actively pursuing, like he did when he wrote the book, later wrote the book, Jadoo, those experiences he had in foreign countries. Well,
there's probably no way to tell. I remember we had a guest who was later disgraced because he said he went to Stanford. He didn't, but he was an expert in a lot of things, chemist, and I don't know, you used to get into some interesting discussions. You hadn't started to study Ben sound yet, but that you went to school for that. The whole ghost box thing, I just had doubts. He said it was an AM signal that was being received that he could use, and I went to ask him, does that mean the guy on the other side has an AM transmitter?
Well, our gracious station manager, Dave Richards, actually chimed in at one point. I think it was actually immediately after the show. He came down.
He did,
and he was talking to us for a minute. And he was like, "What we're doing right now is amplitude modulation, AM."
Mm-hmm.
And I
remember that conversation.
And I was like, "Oh wow, yeah, no, he's right."
Yeah.
And so I was like, "Yeah, I'm pretty sure guy over there was full of it, because that doesn't." Because either way, you'd need to do something physically would have to be happening to disturb the air molecules.
Well,
so,
exactly.
You're just back at square one.
So I don't know what. There's probably no time to discuss that, but there is time for you to give us websites, books, where people can find out more about you, if you would, please. And hold up the book again, would you?
Sure. It's available on Amazon. and it's it's not just biographical. It's got biographical information about John Keel and his life, but also his influence on me, and that's it gave me an opportunity to kind of showcase a lot of anomalous stories that I've heard that, I was looking at areas that Keel would have looked at, and, the influence he had in other people and people who knew Keel and had experienced things through Keel and such. And then my online magazine, Alternate Perceptions, actually started as a little 4-page printed newsletter
it's
back in
excellent, by the way, and that's coming from an editor. Yeah, you send it to me. You always email it to me. I appreciate that. And
it was Paraufology Forum in the beginning. Now it's Alternate Perceptions, and it's comes out once a month online, the first of each month, and we're over 250 editions now, and still going strong.
Wow.
But we have, different features. It's apmagazine.info is the website. And people can also subscribe to a little newsletter we'll send out telling what's in each issue. We have various columns and, submitted features, and we have letters to the editor and book reviews and so forth. So
yeah, it's great stuff. Now, what about your other books?
My first book was Visitors from Hidden Realms, which I just happen to have a copy right here. Back in 2004, Brad Steiger wrote a great introduction there for it, and dealt with a lot of UFO contact, Native American, shamanic type information, insights. And then back in 2009, this one right here, On the Edge of Reality, and this was published by Tim Beckley of Global Communications back in 2009. And it's a lot of the interviews that I had done over the years in Alternate Perceptions, and just kind of reworked into this book.
Great. Well, I'm afraid we're out of time, Brent. But Brent Raynes, thank you for a fascinating conversation. We'll be in touch off the air, and we'll do this again.
All right. Well, thank you, Paul and Ben. Appreciate it. Enjoyed it.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll get to our announcement section here. And all our planned spring events obviously have been canceled because of the global pandemic. However, we are working, as we've been saying, on an online charity event, hopefully, which we will probably do monthly for charities that are working to protect us in this bizarre time. We do hope that all this will be blowing over soon, and that our fall events will be able to take place, particularly the Exeter UFO Festival on Labor Day weekend, September 5th and 6th, and certainly that's at the Exeter Town Hall in New Hampshire. It's one of our favorite events, and certainly the Greater New England UFO Conference, which takes place on Columbus Day weekend in October, and that's going to be in Leominster, Mass. And we hope that will be able to take place as well.
Don't forget, you're the keynote speaker for that event as well.
Oh, right. That's
kind of a big deal.
My long in the tooth 50 years on the paranormal, I guess that's the reason for that.
Yes.
And look for us on the Travel Channel in October as well, and we'll tell you more about that when the time comes.
And don't forget to check out our books, BehindTheParanormal.com. You can find out all about all the books we have, and you can get them from various retailers as well, but you can also get autographed copies from our online bookstore at BehindTheParanormal.com.
So what's going on next week, Ben?
So next week, for the next 2 weeks, actually, we'll bring you back-to-back open line shows. So that's May 3rd and May 10th. Because we've been inundated with questions related to the current global health crisis and possible connections with some aspects of the multiverse and the paranormal with our famous guest co-host Shane Searway.
Yeah, it's amazing some of the questions we've gotten, but they're pertinent. Anyway, we'll leave you this afternoon with a quote from none other than John Keel. "They are not from outer space. There is no need for them to be. They have always been here," unquote. Put that in your pipe and smoke it, I guess. All right.
Wow, what a great way to end the show.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm Paul Eno.
And I'm Ben Eno. And thanks for joining us on our great cosmic journey. Everyone be safe, stay healthy, be responsible human beings, and we'll see you next time on Behind the Paranormal.
Return to this radio frequency 167 hours from now for another edition of Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno.